When Sarah Whitfield unfolded the gray wool blanket at the foot of bed 14, her hands went still before her mind understood why. Stitched into the frayed corner in thread gone thin and gray with age was a name she had not spoken aloud in 11 years, David Whitfield, her brother, a man the United States Army had declared missing, presumed dead in a field report she still kept folded inside her Bible. She stood there in the fluorescent hush of the Veterans Affairs long-term care ward, the blanket trembling in her grip, and for the first time in over a decade, she let herself believe in something she had buried a long time ago. Hope. The ward was quiet at that hour, the particular quiet of a place where suffering has settled into routine. Machines breathed where men could not. Wheels squeaked on linoleum, polished to a dull shine by 1,000 indifferent shifts. Sarah had been a volunteer at the Ashford County 5 Medical Center for 3 years, ever since her divorce left her with too many empty evenings and a need to be useful to somebody, anybody, since she had failed to be useful to the one person who had needed her most. She folded linens. She read letters to men who could no longer see well enough to read them themselves. She sat beside beds where no family ever came, because someone should, because silence was its own kind of cruelty. And she had learned that the hard way. Bed 14 belonged to a man the staff called, in the flat administrative language of institutions, Patient Doe. He had arrived 4 years earlier, transferred from an overseas military hospital with a file so thin it was almost an insult. No name. No fingerprint match in any database the Army was willing to search twice. No dog tags, no unit patch, nothing but a body carved with old shrapnel scars and a mind that had, according to the neurologists, simply stopped answering the door. Severe retrograde amnesia, the chart read, likely secondary to traumatic brain injury and blast concussion. He did not speak. In 4 years, not one word. He looked at people sometimes with an intensity that unsettled the nurses, as though he were searching their faces for someone who was never there, and then the light would go out of his eyes again, and he would return to whatever gray country he lived in now. Sarah had sat with him a dozen times over the past year, more out of habit than purpose. She read to him from paperback westerns because a nurse once told her his eyes tracked more when the prose was simple and rhythmic. She had never once suspected what she was truly circling. The way a woman might walk past her own house for years without noticing a door she had never opened. And now she stood holding a blanket that should not exist, stitched with a name that belonged to a brother who had vanished in a war 7,000 miles from this room, and the fluorescent lights above her seemed to hum louder, as if the building itself were holding its breath alongside her. She had to remind herself to breathe. She had to remind herself that blankets get mixed up in institutions like this one, that names get stitched into government-issue linens for 100 boring reasons, that grief had made her see ghosts before and would gladly do it again if she let it. But her hands did not believe the reasonable version of events. Her hands were already turning toward bed 14, toward the man whose chart said nothing and whose blanket said everything, and somewhere beneath 11 years of scar tissue, something in Sarah Whitfield's chest cracked open like ice giving way on a frozen river in the first warm week of spring. To understand what that blanket meant, you would have to go back to the winter Sarah was 26, standing in her parents' kitchen in Millhaven, Ohio, listening to a man in a dress uniform explain, in careful government sentences, that her brother's convoy had been struck outside a village whose name she could never afterward remember correctly. David had been 29. A staff sergeant 3 tours deep, the kind of soldier who wrote home more often than he needed to because he knew his mother worried, who had once carried an injured stray dog 4 miles back to a forward operating base because he could not stand the thought of leaving anything to die alone. The official finding was missing in action, later amended, after a search that Sarah always suspected was shorter and less thorough than the family had been told, to presumed killed in action, remains not recovered. There had been a funeral with no casket. There had been a folded flag that her mother kept on the mantel until the day she died 3 years later, of what the doctors called heart failure, and Sarah privately called a broken heart with a slower clock than most. There had been 11 years of Sarah driving past David's old bedroom door, left exactly as he'd left it, unable to either clear it out or stop opening it, as though one day he might simply walk back through and need his things exactly where he'd put them. She had never fully accepted the word presumed. It is a strange, cruel word for a family to live inside. It promises nothing and forecloses nothing. It leaves a door cracked open just wide enough for false hope to slip through in the middle of the night and just narrow enough that hope can never quite get all the way inside either. Sarah had spent a decade trying to close that door herself because leaving it open had nearly cost her everything: her marriage, her sleep, her ability to sit in a quiet room without her mind sprinting toward every unanswered question. And now a stranger's blanket had kicked that door wide open again, and she stood frozen in a VA hospital hallway, terrified to walk through it and equally terrified to turn away. She brought the blanket to the nursing station with a steadiness in her voice that cost her everything she had. "Where did this come from?" she asked, and the charge nurse, a heavy-set, kind-eyed woman named Renata, who had worked the ward longer than anyone, glanced at the stitching and shrugged in the particular way of someone who has seen bureaucracy produce far stranger things than a mismatched name. "Supply closet rotation, probably," she said. "Blankets get requisitioned in bulk, sometimes from other facilities, sometimes donated by families of patients who passed. Names get stitched in by volunteers sometimes, memorial programs, that kind of thing. It happens more than you'd think." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, Sarah would think later, the kind of reasonable explanation people reach for specifically because the alternative is too large to hold. She asked carefully, gently, whether she could see Patient Doe's admission file, the transfer records, anything at all that might trace where he had come from before Ashford. Renata's face changed, not unkindly, but with the particular caution of someone who has watched hope do damage before. "Sarah, honey," she said, "we get families in here every year chasing a resemblance. It tears them up worse than not knowing at all. I'm not saying don't look. I'm saying be careful with your own heart while you do it." Renata had worked the long-term ward for 19 years, long enough to have watched hope arrive and detonate in this building more times than she could count. She had seen mothers convinced that a stranger's jawline matched a son lost in a different war entirely, had seen wives drive 11 hours on the strength of a single blurry photograph, only to leave 2 days later with their faces gray and their shoulders lower than when they'd arrived. Hope, in a place like this, was not always the gentle thing people imagined it to be. It could be a scalpel. It could open a person right back up along a seam that had only just finished healing. She was not trying to be cruel to Sarah. She was trying, in the only language 19 years of grief work had taught her, to hand a friend a warning label before the friend swallowed something that might not agree with her. But Sarah had already spent 11 years being careful with her heart, rationing it like a resource that might run out, and something about the stitched name on that blanket had made carefulness feel, for the first time in a decade, like the wrong instinct entirely. She thanked Renata for the warning. She meant it. And then she went home and pulled the old case file out of the closet shelf where it had lived, untouched for longer than she wanted to admit. There was a particular kind of cold that lived in Sarah's chest that afternoon, the cold of a memory she had spent years trying to keep sealed. She remembered the exact texture of the folded flag her mother kept on the mantel, the way the triangular fabric caught dust in its creases no matter how often it was cleaned, as though grief itself had a residue that settled into cloth. She remembered her mother standing at the kitchen window every evening at 6 o'clock for the first 2 years after the notification, watching the driveway, waiting for headlights that never came, until one day she simply stopped watching, and Sarah had understood, even as a young woman, that something inside her mother had quietly closed a door that could never be reopened. She remembered promising herself, at the funeral with no casket, that she would not let herself become her mother, would not spend years at a window waiting for a car that would never arrive. She had built an entire adult life around that promise, and now a name stitched into government-issue wool thread had cracked the promise clean in half. Sarah did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and the 11-year-old case file she had never been able to throw away, cross-referencing dates, units, deployment regions, anything that might connect a nameless man in Bed 14 to a brother the Army had given up on searching for years ago. At 2 in the morning, she found the first thread that would not let her go. The blast that had likely caused Patient Doe's injuries, according to a partial medical note buried on page 6 of his thin file, had occurred within the same operational window, in the same general region, as the ambush that took David's convoy. It proved nothing. It was, any honest person would admit, closer to coincidence than evidence. But Sarah had spent 11 years learning the difference between a fact and a feeling, and this feeling had the particular gravity of something true trying to surface through a great deal of water. The next morning she went back to Bed 14 before her shift officially started. The man lay as he always lay, propped against pillows, staring at the middle distance with the practiced stillness of someone who had trained his body to survive stillness. She sat beside him, the way she had a dozen times before, but this time she did not open a paperback western. This time she talked. She told him about a boy who had once carried an injured dog 4 miles rather than leave it to die alone. She told him about a mother who kept a folded flag on a mantle for 3 years until her own heart gave out from the weight of it. She told him her name, slowly, deliberately, the way you might speak to someone standing at the edge of a very high ledge, someone you were trying to talk gently back toward solid ground. "My name is Sarah," she said, "Sarah Whitfield." For 11 years, doctors and nurses had spoken words at that man and watched them pass through him like light through water, leaving no ripple anyone could measure. But when Sarah said her own last name, his hand, resting motionless on the blanket for 4 years running, closed slowly around the fabric. Renata, passing the doorway with a medication cart, stopped so abruptly the wheels squealed against the linoleum. In 4 years, she said later, voice unsteady, she had never once seen him move like that. Not once. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself arriving earlier and staying later, until her volunteer shifts began to blur into something closer to a vigil. She brought in an old photograph, curling at the corners, of David at 19 standing in front of their parents' garage with an arm slung around a dog long since passed and propped it on the bedside table where his eyes might land on it by accident if not by intention. She brought in a cassette recording, transferred laboriously to a phone speaker, of their mother's voice reading a bedtime story neither of them had heard in over 20 years, and played it low in the room while she folded linens, watching his face for any flicker the machines could not measure. Corbin, the patient advocate, warned her more than once that this kind of intensive, improvised stimulation was not standard protocol, that it could just as easily agitate a fragile mind as heal one. Sarah listened to every warning. She ignored none of the medical guidance, but she also understood something the charts could not capture, which was that a man cannot be reached by protocol alone, that sometimes what reopens a locked door is not clinical precision but the specific, irreplaceable frequency of a voice that once sang you to sleep. It would be tempting, in the retelling, to say that was the moment everything resolved. That recognition bloomed instantly and the family was reunited in a single tearful afternoon. Real recovery, real identification, real justice, none of it works that fast, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What actually happened was slower, harder, and in its own way more remarkable, because it required an entire broken system to be pushed inch by stubborn inch by a woman who refused to let a folder marked "presumed stay closed." Sarah requested formally that patient Doe be evaluated for possible identification against her brother's service record. The hospital's patient advocate, a tired, overworked man named Corbin who had fielded 100 false hopes before, warned her plainly that DNA comparison against a decade-old case with no recovered remains and a family sample that might not even be on file anymore could take months and might, in the end, prove nothing at all. Sarah told him she understood. She did not really, not in the part of her that had waited 11 years for a door to open. But she signed every form he put in front of her, and she drove 90 minutes each way to submit a cheek swab at a lab that processed veteran identification cases, and she began, for the first time in over a decade, to allow herself to imagine what it might mean if the door on the other side of presumed actually opened. While the lab work crawled forward through the particular molasses of military bureaucracy, Sarah kept showing up at bed 14. She learned to read the smallest signals in a man who had none of the ordinary ones. A slight shift in his breathing when she mentioned their mother's garden, a tightening around his eyes, so faint a stranger would have missed it entirely when she described the smell of rain on the gravel drive outside their childhood house. He did not speak, he did not weep, but something in him was listening in a way it had not listened to anyone in 4 long years. And the staff who had cared for him without hope for so long began cautiously to let themselves hope alongside her. It was Renata, 3 weeks into this slow unfolding, who found the second thread. Reviewing the old, incomplete transfer file more carefully than anyone had bothered to in years, she noticed a partial serial number on a piece of damaged equipment that had been cataloged alongside patient Doe on his arrival. A burned fragment of body armor too degraded for the original overseas hospital to trace. cross-referenced against surviving supply records from David Whitfield's unit. That fragment matched a batch issued to his company in the exact month of his disappearance. It was not proof. Serial numbers on military equipment get reissued, transferred, mixed up in the chaos of a war zone more often than any clean narrative would like to admit. But it was another thread pulling in the same direction, and threads pulling in the same direction enough times, in Sarah's experience, stop being coincidence and start being a rope. The DNA results, when they finally came back 7 weeks later, arrived not with fanfare, but with a phone call from a lab technician reading numbers off a screen in a voice trained to be neutral about the most consequential sentences a person might ever hear. The comparison, run against Sarah's own submitted sample and a partial paternal reference pulled from an old military dental record, returned a familial match probability that Corbin, reading the report over the phone to Sarah with his voice cracking on the final line, called in 18 years of doing this work the strongest result he had ever personally delivered. Patient Doe, the nameless man in bed 14, the man who had not spoken in 4 years, was David Whitfield, missing, not killed, alive. What had happened to him, pieced together over the following months from fragments of intelligence reports, testimony from 2 surviving members of his unit tracked down through veteran networks, and eventually, agonizingly slowly from David's own returning memory, was this. The ambush that took his convoy had not simply overrun it. In the chaos of the attack, David had pulled a critically wounded junior soldier, a private barely out of basic training named Elias Mercer, from a burning vehicle, dragging him nearly a quarter-mile under fire to a ravine where he believed correctly that they had a chance to survive the night undetected. The blast that eventually caught them both, when a secondary device detonated near their position, tore through David's skull with enough force to erase, in the space of a single unbearable second, almost everything he had ever known about himself. Local fighters found him before American forces could reach the site. What followed was a fractured, brutal odyssey through field hospitals with no interest in identifying an unmarked foreign soldier, transfers between facilities with incomplete records, and eventually, years later, quiet repatriation to American military medical custody once a humanitarian transfer agreement finally moved him, still nameless, still silent, into a system that had no idea who it was caring for. Elias Mercer, the private David had dragged from the burning vehicle, had survived that night. He had gone home. He had, for 11 years, believed the sergeant who saved his life had died doing it, and had carried that debt the way men carry the debts they can never repay, quietly, permanently, reshaping the whole architecture of a life around it. When investigators working the case Sarah's persistence had reopened, finally tracked Elias down to a small engineering firm outside Denver, the man broke down on the phone before they had finished explaining why they were calling. "He is alive," the investigator told him. "He said your name before he said his own." That detail, when Sarah heard it, undid something in her that 11 years of grief had never quite managed to reach. Her brother, a man who could not remember his own mother's face, who could not recall his own childhood bedroom or the sound of his own name for 4 straight years, had held on to one thing through all of it. A promise, made in a burning ravine under enemy fire, that he would get that boy home alive. Somewhere beneath the wreckage of his memory, that promise had survived when almost nothing else had, and it had been, the doctors would later theorize, the single thread of continuity his fractured mind clung to through years of institutional silence. He had kept faith with a stranger's life, even as he lost the map to his own. The reunion itself, when it finally came, was not the cinematic instant so many people picture when they imagine a story like this one. David did not sit up in bed and say Sarah's name the moment she walked through the door with the confirmed results in her trembling hands. Recovery from that kind of injury, the neurologists were careful to explain, is rarely a door swinging open. It is more often a long hallway with many doors, opening one at a time, on their own unpredictable schedule. But 3 days after the results came back, as Sarah sat beside his bed reading once again from a paperback Western because some habits are their own kind of medicine, David's hand found hers on the blanket, and he said in a voice rusted from 4 years of silence, one word, "Sarah," the childhood nickname no one else on earth had used since their mother died. Sarah did not remember deciding to cry. She simply found a moment later that she already was. Elias Mercer flew in 9 days after that. He walked into the ward in his dress clothes, a man in his 30s now, carrying a folded flag of his own, one he had kept for 11 years on a shelf as a private memorial to a sergeant he believed he owed his life to and would never get to thank. When David's eyes found him across the room, something moved behind them that the staff, gathered quietly in the hallway to witness it, would describe afterward as the closest thing to a full sunrise they had ever seen happen on a human face. He did not have all the words yet. He might never fully recover all of them. But he lifted one hand, slowly, and Elias crossed the room and took it in both of his own and knelt beside the bed of the man who had dragged him a quarter-mile through fire and never once, in 11 years of silence, let go of the promise that had gotten them both this far. The Army's formal review that followed, prompted by the case and by the public attention it eventually drew, would go on to correct David Whitfield's status from presumed deceased to recovered living veteran, a bureaucratic phrase that could never come close to containing what it actually meant to the family that had spent 11 years learning to live around an absence. It also prompted quietly a broader review of identification protocols for unidentified patients transferred through overseas military medical channels, a slow, imperfect but real change born from one volunteer nurse's refusal to accept the word presumed as a permanent verdict. Sarah brought the gray wool blanket home with her, eventually after the hospital administration, moved by the story and unable to argue with a family's request for the one object that had begun it all, released it into her keeping. She did not wash the stitching out. She folded it and placed it at last at the foot of the bed in the room that had stood untouched for 11 years, David's childhood bedroom, waiting now not as a shrine to an absence but as a place a living man could finally, slowly come home to. Some doors, it turns out, are worth leaving cracked open, no matter how long the wait, no matter how unreasonable the hope, because sometimes, against every probability a file full of grim government language can produce, someone does walk back through. There's a particular image from those weeks that the hospital staff still talk about years later, when new nurses join the ward and someone inevitably tells them the story of bed 14. It is not the moment of the DNA results, nor even the moment David first said his sister's name. It is a quieter afternoon, several weeks into his recovery, when Elias Mercer returned for a second visit and brought his young daughter with him, a girl of 6 who had never known the full story of the sergeant her father spoke of only in careful, reverent fragments. She walked up to David's bedside without any of the caution the adults in the room had learned to carry, climbed onto the visitor's chair and asked him, with the blunt clarity only children manage, if it had hurt when he saved her daddy. David, whose vocabulary was still returning to him one fragile word at a time, looked at her for a long moment and then said slowly, "No, it had not hurt, it had felt," he told her, like the only thing that had ever made complete sense. The staff who witnessed that exchange still describe it as the moment they understood the full shape of what had happened in that ward, that a man who had lost nearly everything else about himself, his childhood, his mother's face, the sound of his own name, had never once lost the memory of why he had done what he did. Trauma, the doctors would later write in a case study that quietly circulated through veteran neurology circles, does not erase a person's values so much as it strips everything else away and reveals which values were load-bearing all along. For David Whitfield, apparently, one promise had been load-bearing enough to survive an explosion that took nearly everything else. David Whitfield's recovery continues to this day, slow, non-linear, and entirely his own, supported by a sister who never stopped looking, a stranger whose life he saved and who never stopped searching for a way to say thank you, and a hospital staff who learned alongside all of them that a name stitched quietly into a blanket can sometimes be the loudest thing in an entire silent building. It is easy, in a world so full of noise, to stop believing that loyalty this deep still exists, that a promise made in the worst moment of a person's life can outlast even the loss of that person's own memory of making it. But it happened. In a plain, fluorescent-lit ward in Ashford County, it happened, and everyone who witnessed it walked away changed by the knowledge that some bonds, it turns out, run so deep that not even the body forgetting itself can fully erase them. You have just watched the story of bonds that the heart never forgets, even when the body does. If this miraculous journey touched your heart, please don't forget to like the video and share this story of loyalty with your loved ones. To make sure you don't miss similar real-life stories and to become a part of our family, you can subscribe to our channel. Do you believe that love and promises can truly defy time? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section.